Hi, Rod Fleming in the Philippines here. I'm going to do a short series of pieces about transgenderism, transgender, transsexualism as it appears in other cultures. Now, we discussed a fair bit about how it appears in Southeast Asian culture, and it's very important that we understand that. But I want to talk for a while, do a couple of videos on the subject of this subject, but inside Islamic culture, Arabic culture, basically. Now, we're going to start, and I'm going to refer to this, some notes here. It says that different perspectives of transgenderism are discussed in Islam. Among them is Mukkanathun, and Mukkanathun is the plural, Mukkanath is singular, one Mukkanath, several Mukkanathun. Mukkanathun is a term used in traditional Arab history to refer to a transgender woman. The word has the same meaning as, and I quote, effeminate ones, or men resemble women. It's important to note here that a Mukkanath is an individual who cannot be related to the gay community, as their characters are quite different from them. One can say that Mukkanath are queer or belong to the Kawajasira community. It is quite surprising that they have always been a part of Islamic history, even during the time of the Prophet. In fact, they're mentioned in the Quran. Now, this story goes on to talk about a person called Nawawi, who is a famous scholar of the Hadith. The Hadith, to let you know, are the commentaries on the Quran. There are three major, well really four, but essentially three major texts, groups of texts in Islam that are core to the culture. The first is, of course, the Quran. Then there are the Hadiths, and there is the Sirah, and these, how can we put this, these contextualize and explain the sometimes quite obscure sense that's conveyed by the Quran. And that has led to an enormous amount of confusion and loads and loads and loads of debate. But that's not the point here. Anyway, this person, Nawawi, categorizes the Mukkanath into two important types. And the first one he calls Mukkanath min kalkin. This type belongs to those males who are born with feminine traits. There's no sin of being in that situation in Islam, as long as the individual doesn't indulge in forbidden activities. And he goes on to say that within our society, these people would be known as transsexuals. Now, he's clearly talking about HSTS here, sexual inverts. He's talking about people who are born male, but with the physical and sexual and psychological characteristics of females, of women. So that's your classic sexual invert, your HSTS. For them, they can't do anything but be as they are. And that's really the point. Number two is Mukkanath bi al-Takaluf, and any Arabic speakers, I'm really sorry. You're just going to have to forgive me that. And these are men who purposely act like women without being born with any feminine traits or without having a gender identity problem in their youth. According to the teachings of Islam, these kind of activities are actually sinful. Now, I'm not going to comment on this idea of sin and not sin. I'm not a Muslim, but it's quite clear that he's talking about autogynephiles, what we would call non-homosexual transitioners, right? That's the autogynephiles. These are the people who, they were ordinary boys, they didn't show any inclination towards the classic sexual behavior or sexual inverts. Sometime in adolescence or adulthood, they became, if you like, they became women. Now, in terms of status in society, this article, and it's very well, it's been translated from Arabic, so I'm having to kind of work it through because translation's a bit iffy, but it does correspond to what I've read, certainly in my reading of Arabic texts. He says, throughout Islamic history, Mukkanathun were accepted and treated very well. And again, this is basically true. Until very recently, what we're calling Mukkanathun, transgenders and transsexuals were basically, they were fine in Islam. Many scholars also mentioned that the status of a Mukkanath during the days of Islam was mostly accepted by the people of Medina and Mecca. They have a strong affiliation with the field of music and entertainment and are considered as the companions in the sense that, the companions of women, in the sense that they associated with women and not with men. During the period of the Holy Prophet, Mukkanath was given a higher place of honour. They were given the title Guardians of Sacred Boundaries, in which they were given the privilege to guard one of the most sacred harem of Medina and Mecca. Now, in fact, a lot of these would have been eunuchs. And again, I'll make a point which I've made before, I will make again, which is that there is a tendency in the West, which has been assisted, I have to say, by some thoroughly obscure historian, to believe that eunuchs were, you know, these massive, great big, huge, muscled Nubian warriors who'd had been castrated basically to make them tame enough to keep as slaves. It's absolutely not the case. That did happen. It certainly was the case that in many cultures, enemy prisoners taken in war were castrated and then made into slaves because they believed that castrating them would make them more peaceful and less likely to cause trouble. But most eunuchs were actually not like that at all. They were taken as boys, very young boys sometimes, and castrated before or just after puberty, depending what the result was that you desired, or the master, owner really desired. And the point here is they were basically making trans women, right? But there were few restrictions imposed on Mukkanath at that time, such as they were not allowed to enter the sacred places like the harem, which is quoted in the hadith below. And here it says, the Mukkanath used to enter upon the wives of the Prophet. They, the people, counted him amongst those who were free of physical needs. One day the Prophet entered upon us when he was with one of his wives and was describing the qualities of a woman, saying, when she comes forward with 4 folds in her stomach, and when she goes backward with 8. The Prophet said, I do not see that this man knows where he lies. And that is Sunan Abu Dawud, book 32. You can actually get these from my site still. They're still up there. If you actually want to read the hadith in the Quran, go to rodafleming.com and just find the downloads page, and yeah, you can take these down from there. In another hadith, it was forbidden by the Holy Prophet for a Mukkanath to resemble it in physical appearance a woman, as is mentioned in the hadith below. Here, they make a big story about how the Prophet, on being confronted with this particular Mukkanath, just banished her, and rather than kill her, and he said, no. I have been prohibited from killing people who pray. Hadith is also taken to mean that the Quran, the Holy Prophet, never allowed the killing of Mukkanath. And unfortunately, that's not the case today. They make the point here. And sadly, the status of transgender, again, we're talking about India, our society is miserable. Besides knowing the fact that Islam itself, sorry, I can't read any more of that, it's just too confused. But it's well worth understanding that within Islam, the idea of trans women is absolutely not surprising. It's, if you know, women have always been a highly protected class in Islam, and you know, there are ways of looking at that, some favourable, some unfavourable, but essentially women were untouchable for most men, and so the men got up to different things in order to gain sexual relief, and one of these, as we've discussed in another video, was to have basically pederasty, sex with boys, but they also had sex with eunuchs. And this wasn't just, you know, like your ordinary working people. They couldn't afford that sort of thing. These were rich, wealthy men, and they would take young males, typically in the age range of, you know, 8 and up, and at the appropriate time, depending, as I say, on what result they wanted, these would be castrated. They would have their testicles, or perhaps the entire thing, removed, and at the same time they would be trained in a way very, not dissimilar anyway, to the way that geisha in Japan were trained. They were trained to sing, to dance, to entertain men, to be sexually fulfilling for men, and to do this with great joy. And at the same time, there was an understanding across the Islamosphere that when they came to the end of their lives as concubines, which is essentially what they were, they weren't thrown on the heap, as is sometimes imagined. In fact, they basically entered the civil service, and you would find that for example, the whole of Persia, most of the Arabic countries, Egypt, Mughal India, all of these, they were actually run by eunuchs, and that is trans women, right? They weren't run by women, because women weren't allowed to interface with men in that way, and they were not run by men. Why were they not run by men? The reason for that is quite interesting. From my reading, it appears to be that the real reason that within these societies men were not normally senior bureaucrats, was because they could have children, and as a result of being able to do that, could potentially pose a dynastic threat to the king, that be the sultan, the caliph, or whatever he was, to the ruler. Now, there's no way that a eunuch, a trans woman, can do that. She can't have children, and she can't father them either, because the equipment necessary to do so has been lopped off. So what would happen is these trans women would be, if they were liked and enjoyed by their masters, and this extended through all strata of society, except the very, very poorest. But typically, such a person who was liked by his master would be honoured and might go into, as I say, the civil service, some other area, might go and run the master's business for him, might manage the books, keep books and everything else like that. See, again, men didn't trust their sons. Their opinion was that if the son is working in the business, he's almost certainly siphoning off cash for himself. Whereas they believed that this boy, who had been made into woman, who after all had been his lover when younger, was far more trustworthy and could be relied on to look after the man's business in a good and proper way. We know this was the case. There's loads of documentation of it, and I will do some more, actually, if it interests you, to show you how this worked out. Really, one story which is always worth telling is that of Alexander of Macedon, Alexander the Great, and a eunuch called Bagoas. Now, we're not exactly sure if that was the name of the person or the rank. It's not really clear. The different texts make different claims, but anyway, we'll just call her Bagoas. And this was a highly feminine trans woman, eunuch, with and Alexander fell absolutely for her because she was really very beautiful. This would not have been unusual. It absolutely wouldn't have been unusual in the ancient world for men to be very much taken by these people. So there's this tradition in pre-Arabic and Arabic world of what are called the Mukkanat. They have specific names in different parts, and we'll discuss some of those later. But the idea that Islam is wholly and completely hostile, which is widely promulgated in the West, and it's very much the way that people in the West tend to think of it, is simply not true. Islam is not, there's many problems with Islam, but there are many problems with Christianity too. Islam is not monolithic. You can't look at the most extreme forms, like the Saudi Arabian form, and say that that is typical of Islam across the planet. It simply isn't. I mean, they might claim that they are the honest and true followers of the Prophet, but everybody else does the same thing. They make the same claim. And many parts of the Islamosphere trans women have been very prominent for a very, very long time. We'll talk a little bit about the situation in Turkey, for example, and also in Mughal Italy, India rather. But the point to understand is that whether this tradition of trans women and the roles they played in society were introduced through Islam, or whether they were simply pre-existing and thus were adopted into Islamic culture where it sort of took over, they were definitely there. They absolutely were there. So anyway, I'll leave that for just now. Take care. Bye bye.